This video is our lecture for organizing qualitative data. So make sure you have your note sheets out as we go through that, even maybe your textbook, maybe StatCrunch open. So let's go ahead and get started on that. The first question where you're prompted with is this idea: what is raw data, and what are ways to organize that? So that's something I want you thinking about real quick. So you thought about it. Raw data is just unorganized data. So it's the data that we have before we start putting it into the ways we organize it, which is through tables, graphs, charts. And so that's how we organize the data. Unorganized data, just kind of data that looks like what we see in example 1. And so that would be what we're looking at. And so we're going to go ahead and look at example 1. And to complete example 1, what we need to do is we need to make what we call a frequency distribution. Frequency meaning how often something happens. And a frequency distribution kind of shows you how the data is kind of spread out, or how often something happens. Frequency distribution is what you would put in there. And so this first example is to make a frequency distribution. The way you do that is basically you make a table of values. I'm going to start it by hand, but I'm going to show you on StatCrunch. And so this is your body part right here. And then this would be what we call your frequency. And so the back, how many times is the back? So when we organize it, we would then count out how many times that would occur. A way to kind of organize that thinking would be here in terms of have the data already and have the raw data entered in for this first example. You can see all this information. And what you would do with using technology is I would use StatCrunch, tables, and then frequency. And then I want to make it of that first example, and that's it. And then you compute. And what comes up is this table right here. And so you can see the back would come up 14 times, elbow 1, growing 3, and so forth. We'll talk about this in the next piece here, relative frequency. What you see is the decimal values. This is just 14 divided by the total amount, which is 35. But this here is an example of a frequency table or frequency distribution. So I want to make sure you make note of that. And so, for example, again, the back occurs how many times? 14 times. And so that's what technically what we would put in this spot right here would be 14, because this is how often it comes up. And then you would finish the rest there with that. And so StatCrunch, this is what you would put in for that example there. This part right here, how often. This number we're going to look at next. But that's an example of a frequency table or frequency distribution. And so the next piece is the relative frequency is the proportion. So now we're getting a definition for that, and here are the formula for that. And then what is the relative frequency distribution? That's what I had just shown you right here. This here is, instead of how often, it's the decimal value when you take 14 divided by the total amount. So that's what we're looking at there. So let's complete that. And so here's the formula for relative frequency. Get it either from the book or from your from the PowerPoints I have. It's the frequency divided by the sum of all frequencies. And if you wanted to kind of look at it in a more neater fashion, we could get to that somewhere here on the PowerPoints that I've shared with you here. There we go. Relative frequency is equal to the frequency divided by the sum. And what is the relative frequency distribution? It lists each category of data with the relative frequency. So if you need to pause and get that down, you can there. Otherwise, let's continue with our notes here. And so this next example, I have kind of some math already here. Here's a frequency distribution table here. What would the relative frequency look like? The important to acknowledge here is that to get the relative frequency, you're going to do the frequency divided by the total. That's where you see there was 30 in total here. And then we have 12 with back. Again, this data is slightly different than what we have up there. And so you get 0.4. And then if we need to report that as a percent, it would equal 40%. For hand, it's 2 divided by 30, because that's the total amount. You get 0.0667. And that would be 6.7% if we wanted to. But relative frequency is in a decimal form of a value less than 1, between 0 and 1. And you can easily convert that to percent by moving that decimal over twice, 6.67 or 6.7%. When working with relative frequency distribution, what should the total be when you add all these up? Well, when you add all these up, this equals 30. Now, if I calculated all the relative frequencies, the total should be equal to 1. And again, you see I had shown you that's what we ended up with over here in this example. Then again, the numbers are different than that example we have, but you see this here, if we added all that up, that would be equal to 1. And that's an important factor in terms of relative frequency because it has to equal to 100%. And so that's the idea there. So this is the first part of 2.1, organizing data in a relative, in a frequency distribution or in a relative frequency distribution.